Okay, next question.
Okay, I have a couple of quick comments and then a question for the panel. And,
Could you speak up just a
I
little
said
bit?
I have
Thank you.
a couple of comments and a question. And one comment is that most of what I heard last night and what I've been hearing this afternoon is really about art photography, which is a very, very small subset of photography. But that's okay, we're in an art museum. That's just one comment. And the other thing, in terms of photographic practice or photography now, aside from art photography or commercial photography or photojournalism, if you go out on the street and take a look at and talk to 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, they're taking pictures all the time, and then they're dumping them. They're not even posting them to Facebook or YouTube or whatever. They're just taking them, showing to some friends, maybe emailing them or digitally sending them off, and then they dump them. So yes, there are many, many, many more millions of photographs being made and dumped. And I think that that's the practice. How long it will continue, when those people have children, they might change their practice and save a few pictures. But okay, anyway, I had two questions I have. One is, I'm curious, given the variety of things that the panelists have said, I'm curious what each one of you would give as the year, or it doesn't have to be precisely the year, but when contemporary starts. I've heard the word contemporary thrown out. I've also heard that nostalgia for postmodernism. That's really kind of interesting to me. I mean, I'm a modernist, so I mean, there's already nostalgia for postmodernism. It's one thing I'll never suffer from. And the other question I have is, and I can't remember the exact quote. I'm sure a lot of people in the room know it, and that's Walker Evans' comment about photography being the most literary of visual media. Is that still relevant?
There was a dominant tradition that goes from the European Renaissance up through Matisse, Picasso, probably Jackson Pollock, certainly de Kooning, and you know, the institution I work for the painting collection starts in 1880, because from the viewpoint of the 1920s, it looked like there was a big break then. And there was a big break, but it was a big break that started the last great chapter of what we think of as the old master tradition. Something else began to happen in the 60s. Andy Warhol is the poster boy for whatever that something else is. And we're in that now. Now, of course, the photography has a different history that touches on both of these things. But in terms of my operative framework of of how you relate things that are happening now, that's it.
I think there's.
That's my operative framework.
I don't know why. I think the literary question just made me think of something. And I guess I'm a member of the audience now, asking the panel. Do you think there's any relationship between the quality of the 20th century photography and depression?
Clinical depression?
Depression. It's depressionist.
Oh.
No, I'm serious. Because I think there probably is in relationship to literature, and he brought that up. And when I think of the most effective photographers that, I put that at the beginning of my alphabet. They all seem to be kind of downers.
Well, should I say something about that, PL? This is sort of linking in with both questions. I saw that big Edward Batinsky book, Oil, and I know there was a show in Washington as well. And it seemed there was some sort of connection there between the moment of peak oil, maybe, and the moment of peak photography. And that sort of begs the question of what's going to come afterwards, and this kind of question of, is photography over? And it seemed to, and I'll say one other thing as well, that when these technologies, when we hear that a given kind of film is going out of act, they're not making it anymore, people always stash it away, don't they, so that they can keep using that. That's just a bit of background. Anyway, of course, in terms of sort of depression and literature, I think we'd all agree that one of the most depressing, bleak books to have come out in the last 5 years or whatever would be The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And funnily enough, last night, after the session, I started to think of this world of, this thing of, is photography over? And I realized that if I had the skill, I would do one of those YouTube things where I would actually kind of remake the film of The Road, but instead of having that actor in it, I'd have, so that it would have, I don't know, like Lee Friedlander in this bleak world where there's nothing much to photograph and there's no sort of film stock left. So I just had this lovely vision of these photographers trundling their trolleys around this bleak, unphotographable world, looking for film. And of course, as you'll know, in the book and in the film of The Road, I just had this lovely idea. Let's say it's Lee and Maria Friedlander, and they come across this sort of stash. You remember they come across this stash of stuff. So I imagine them getting in there, and of course it's great because suddenly he's got some film again, and so he'll maybe say to Maria, "Hey, come on, take your clothes off. I'm going to do some more of them nudes that I used to do," and then he might decide to do a sort of conceptual piece whereby he's going to take photographs of all this stock of film as a kind of comment on it. But of course, it wouldn't be long really before, just as in the film, they decide they have to leave. They can't stay in this lovely sort of larder of thing. And it's not just because they're worried that, I don't know, Joel Sternfeld and Alex Soth are going to come along and eat them. I think the reason that someone like Lee Friedlander would want to leave is because however bleak and miserable looking the world was, it was still more interesting to go out there and document it than it would be to do this kind of art photography of stacks of film. Yeah. So I see them trundling off again, leaving the sanctuary, taking a lot of film with them, of course, but crucially, they wouldn't take it all. Because however late you come in the tradition, however over you might think things are, there's always somebody coming along after. So I love this idea of them. They trundle off, and then later on, somebody else comes along, and this thing which seems completely exhausted is once again kind of rehabilitated. So or reborn. So that's my little sort of parabolic answer to that question.
That's difficult to follow, but I did enjoy the last comments there. I mean, I think you can have it all ways. Like the poetry of photography, if you see it as a literary form, can continue. But I think it means something different to do it than it did even 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And I mean, with some of your characters in your film, of course, there's an issue of having a voice through a certain physical part of the medium and wanting to stay with that. It's a bit more tricky when it's a 26-year-old stashing 4x5 film, isn't it? I mean, that's a peculiar sort of bent or sort of kind of approach to photography and what you think it is as a young practitioner. I mean, I do worry that if it does continue to be a sort of a self-referencing discussion within contemporary art photography, either, as you say, pictures about making pictures at the time that analogue becomes no longer default and everyone can see it, or indeed wanting just to be deeply reactionary, and continue with the road trips and the jazz of the street and all of that. I mean, one would hope that the impact of the way that we look and the fact that there is this plethora of image production not necessarily for art, but that does shift, surely. It does shift in a positive way, potentially, what within the confines of contemporary art. I mean, I worry about collections in terms of, what does a collection like SFMOMA collect as contemporary, whether they're defining contemporary as post-1965 or in the last 10 years. I mean, what is it reflecting in terms of photography as a discrete discipline?
One of the things I think we've tried to do here, I don't know how successful we've been, is to complicate this sort of the history of photography as best we can. And that's a ever-changing complication. We've always sort of looked at our collecting practices. We tell this history, we fill the gaps, and those gaps change actually as we learn more. I mean, we might not have been collecting scientific photography 20 years ago, but now we're realizing that is a gap, so we go back and fill it, and in contemporary as well. And one of the things about, the difference between reacting to history and reacting to the contemporary period is you have to kind of be nimble and go back and forth and realize that we'll make mistakes and leave gaps for someone else to fill in the future. But we're very interested, I know you said before, about all these different kind of contemporary practices, and it's very slippery. So we're out there sort of grasping at these slippery things the best we can, but I think it's important to complicate that story.
Can I ask you something more about that? I mean, so collecting is a kind of history writing, and history is typically written according to the concerns of the present. So, I mean, do you have a sense in your department of the concerns of the present that lead you to attempt to construct the kind of history that you do?
I hope.
Put it another way. How does something become a gap? How does something suddenly seem like a gap?
Well, sometimes you don't grasp the significance of something in its moment. I mean, I can't think of a good example off the top of my head that would make sense, but you try to pay attention to what's important. Some things that seem important now, in 5 years, we're going to say, I cannot believe we thought that was important. Now this seems totally unimportant. And some things are slowly simmering under the surface. And in 10 years, we're going to look back and say, wow, we really didn't pick up on how really game-changing that was. Some things are only important in retrospect. So we sort of have to try to be as sensitive as we can to what's happening in our own moment, recognizing that, we're human barometers, and to try and recognize and hope that history will correct for our mistakes.
And would you say, just one more, the motivating factors that lead you to kind of decide to collect in a certain area, would you say these are mainly factors that are sort of internal to photography? Or are you responding to interests that might lie outside photography?
Well, as a photo historian, I bring my own set of judgments to photography. So trying to get outside my own head, or our own heads as a department, is that's a difficult exercise. We do try to cast the net more broadly. I mean, things that interest me are works that engage with a history of photography, but not exclusively. We were talking a little bit before about Walead's work, which we just acquired for the collection. And one of the things that made me get really excited about that work was listening to how he talked about it. And for me, it evoked all this language of the 1920s. I don't know if he'd agree with me at all. But he was talking about how he uses these games of chance and sort of these experiments in the darkroom. And to me, that sounded like Rodchenko and the constructivists. And then talking about the colors and the way light is made up and how we perceive light. And to me, it was like Moholy-Nagy would be like beside himself, I think, to see what Walead had done there. And so then to start to think about, well, what does it mean to do that kind of practice in 2010? And that's the kind of question that gets me pretty excited. But, we're admittedly a very strange group of people, and, strange things get me excited. But, that for me was one of the reasons why it made Walead's work so important. I think another person would recognize the work as important, but probably for a completely different set of criteria.
I think it's perhaps a little misleading to reduce the museum's mission to collecting practices as well. I mean, it seems clear that one of the things that we're working around is a kind of crisis around the object. Those gazillion pictures being made on cell phones every day or live in a kind of virtual non-object status through systems of exchange or deletion or whatever it might be. So the larger culture is thinking about lens-based imagery in new ways because of what's going on right now. It puts any museum in a position where it has to rethink what its investment in those material objects are then. So as Corey pointed out earlier, the old-fashioned snapshot print takes on a kind of totemic quality, actually. People don't like destroying those things. They're valuable no matter how bad they are as pictures. They seem to, that's where the miracle comes in. That object can hold something from the past, which isn't what people believe about cell phone pictures anymore, I don't think. So in terms of thinking what the museum's posture towards collecting objects, I would suggest that forward-thinking institutions need to begin to redefine themselves as sites where certain kinds of conversations are had about these issues, like this conversation is happening. One of the things I think SFMOMA has done particularly well is to take those critical challenges that were posed about the museum rather tangentiously in the 80s and 90s about why the vernacular photograph doesn't belong in a museum, and say, why don't we take that statement and turn it into a question? What does it mean for a museum to address their vernacular? It's very messy and problematic, and maybe it makes us look bad, but let's put it up and ask some questions about it. Just putting it up is not asking a question. It's only half of the what the museum's responsibility is. But I think that increasingly, as the larger cultural issues around objects only snowball, that the museum's role as a site for discussion is going to be increasingly important.
I think, Charlotte, I know you have, this is a subject near and dear to your heart. Do you have some things you want to say on that?
Well, I mean, I'm in total agreement with Doug. I think that the site of the museum does shift in terms of, I mean, I mentioned it last night, our reasons to congregate, our reasons to come together. And I think that they're enhanced unreconstructed modernist reasons, like to be with the thing, the aura of the thing itself. That's a good reason to come to a museum. But I also think you're right, it's about the discussion that can be held in an institution like this that deals with the uncertainty of the moment. And I don't feel particularly nostalgic about it. I just think it is one of those moments where it's very difficult for an institution to continue its traditional role with photography to offer a history or the history, a received wisdom supplied to its public, when in fact the jury is out. And you know, if you asked any of us sitting here about our uses of new technologies, it's probably much profoundly less, even if some of you have kids, it's profoundly less than many of your visitors who are coming into the museum. And therefore, I think there is more of a potentially a more discursive atmosphere in a museum and a greater potential for an institution to work out these sensitive and tricky and nuanced issues with its what used to be called public, or what we've been calling audience, but clearly, you know, the balance is quite different from normal.
You had said last night, you had said last night that you thought asking questions rather than just supplying answers was sort of what you were looking for, or allowing it to be a little bit more provisional.
Well, that was definitely in the spirit of a project we did at LACMA called Words Without Pictures, which was about, Walead and George wrote for that project, which was hopefully about having a forum for saying something before it becomes received wisdom. So if you're an academic, not having to qualify it in the way that you would with, you know, the regular formulas, or if you're an artist who doesn't normally write but had a supportive structure to express a point of view which wasn't necessarily about their own work but feelings of the climate. And I mean, I think it was probably the most rewarding thing that I did when I was at LACMA. I mean, because it really was that thoughtful. I mean, people were really earnest and thoughtful about it rather than dogmatic or taking positions, because it just feels, it feels like not the moment to take a position because we're halfway through something.
I think we'll take another question. There have been two people waiting very patiently back there. Thank you.
I'm interested in, because photos clearly have so much power, what the sort of psychological and social impact of the lack of agency in photography and this sort of removal of responsibility. And it came up a little bit last night with how it's the photograph of the event as opposed to the person that takes the photograph. It's whoever has the cell phone camera at a momentous event. And we see this also, the lack of agency that I'm thinking about with people taking a lot of pictures without asking permission, like the ethics in photography are changing. And also with the surveillance of ourselves, like there's so many pictures of us floating around the internet at any given time. And if you look at a news image that's been pulled from Flickr or from YouTube, there won't be the person's name who took the picture. It'll just say Flickr or YouTube, or even Reuters. It often doesn't use the photographer's name. It'll just say Reuters. It's just a company's name as the person who took it. And this, to me, has an eerie resemblance to, like, if I would go to an art museum and see a daguerreotype on the wall, and that daguerreotype would just say anonymous photographer, because we don't know who took that daguerreotype. But now, what about those really important photographs where the photographer wasn't important? Or how are they going to be appearing in museums? What's the wall text going to be?
Does anyone want to tackle that one? Oh, come on. Okay.
I'm curious, when you talk about the lack of agency, what do you mean by that? I mean, I lift my Canon, my Lumix, 300 ZDF or whatever it is, and I go
Joel,
click.
will you put the microphone closer? Or maybe is it? That's better.
My God, it was just... Can you hear me now?
Well, perhaps it's the lack of
Well, no,
agency.
but hold it a second.
Okay.
I make the photograph. Click. Have I left something out in terms of agency? Is there more?
Well, a photograph inherently is a danger in agency because each context it appears in, it's going to shift, and it's going to be remade. And I also think, you can experience an event. You don't have to take a picture of something. You can just look at a picture. Like, I don't think you need to even take pictures necessarily if there's such a bounty of photographs of things. You can just receive them. Like, the lack of agency, like the photos on the internet are just, they're there for the taking. It's.
I'm missing something important.
I think she means editorial control, actually, not agency.
I mean, but editorial control over, which pictures are going to show and which pictures are not going to show. That's one kind of agency. Usually the photographer doesn't exercise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, authorship, or let's say a photograph has a really big effect on people's consciousness, like the Abu Ghraib photographs. So we don't really think about who took those pictures. We think about the pictures themselves. So maybe the responsibility associated with a photograph would be
I'm afraid that part of the problem with the Abu Ghraib photographs is that we do think of who took those pictures, and we know that they're soldiers, and then we know that there are soldiers. Any specific soldier? No. But we do know precisely that. I think you mean authorship rather than agency, and I'm not sure I understand what the problem with authorship or agency is with photography. If, it seems to me, the brilliance of the whole scheme is you go click and it's your picture.
But I guess what I was thinking about is the responsibility for owning pictures. So if I could revise, perhaps the agency was not the right word, because it was more relating to the afterlife of the photographs, which is maybe a few questions in one, but the responsibility of a photograph, yeah.
The accountability of the producer of the particular image.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll replace anonymous with citizen.
We actually don't say anonymous, we say unknown, and that's sort of a distinction, actually. I mean, I think anonymous implies a kind of will to be unidentified, and we say unknown because it's just the fact.
And there, have always been famous, especially news photographs, that are kind of we never think of the author, we think of the picture, that famous picture of the woman being executed and most of these things don't immediately bring an author to mind, they bring a picture to mind. Lots of the pictures taken at 9/11. News photos don't always have an author involved. They have an impact. But there's a difference between that and other kinds of photos. So I think you really just have to make a distinction.
I think we'll take another photo over here. David?
Well, I think there's somebody waiting
there's one.
a little bit longer.
Okay,
there.
all right. That's very generous of you.
Thank you. This is sort of in response to, George, what you mentioned earlier about have we glossed over something here and not discussing this, I think, what is a gaping hole in the conversation thus far about digital versus chemical. And one of the ways that I think it was, I understand the point that sometimes it can be a red herring, and that was brought up yesterday as well. But it also seemed to me that in last night's discussion, it was simply couched using different terminology, and that terminology was the difference between photography and art photography, both in the context of contemporary photo making. And one of the differences was a photography that is self-aware about its own legacy within the history of photography, and artists who use photography as one idiom within a larger type of construction. And in thinking about that, I went through the galleries here at SFMOMA today and was really amazed by the fact that two of the artists who you're highlighting right now, both of whom we think of traditionally as painters, Zigmar Polka, Gerhard Richter, are among the most interesting thinkers, I think, about photography as a medium and photography as a set of possibilities. And I wondered if you could speak more about that. Both of them obviously are referring to chemical photography in their work. But to my mind, they qualify as neither photographers or art photographers per se. So I wondered what the panelists thought about that.
This art and whatever, journalism and, the different categories, I think, there's the one thing that never seems to get discussed, which is always discussed in literature and often discussed in, the conversations about art, or its uses, which are non-literal. They're not depictions of torture, anonymous or not. They use, the standard workhorses of criticism, metaphor, allusion, you name them. You all know what they are. I think that it's easy to comment on photography when you don't actually have to make the image, as I think, well, a lot of people here, but
but both Polka and Richter
Gerhard
do.
Richter probably. I think he did take the picture of his daughter, but and maybe
polka,
even the candle.
There are actually polka photographs.
But if that was a
upstairs.
photograph, you wouldn't look at it twice. I'm just saying that it's one gaping hole here is that the discussion seems to leave out a whole level of potential within any form of imagery, and I don't know. It just dawned on me, I guess.
What do you mean by potential?
I mean, we talk about photography as if it's somehow, distinct from photographs, and its impact as having, we've already had the affective discussion. We had that one last night. But in terms of what photographs deliver, it seems that the best of them are never literal. I mean, it's an internal contradiction within photography. It's a literal medium most of the time, and but it always alludes to something in its best expressions. And I find these conversations a little bit displaced because I don't want to go into who's the top 10 photographers, but I'm sure everybody has an idea of at least one, and they never ever operate on a merely a level of depiction. And it seems to me that one of the problems with all of this discussion about the internet and digital is that literalness, depiction, and agency, and all that stuff, whether it's stock agency or photography agency, is it supersedes what I think we should all be discussing, because the subject is way too vast. We cannot discuss cell phone photographs and art photographs and do a good job of it in one session. So I'm just bringing up the fact that I don't think anybody has really gotten to the point of where's the delivery system that supersedes front brain thinking, It's all about front brain thinking, and I think good art often supersedes it or circumvents it, short circuits it. And I don't know, that's my piece.
Does anyone else want to address her question? George?
I'm confused.
You're confused?
Top 10? Well, I'll just, who's up on the wall here? I mean, come on, I mean.
Just to illustrate your argument.
How about Diane Arbus? She's on the wall. Everybody can go look.
Vote by applause.
Well, I think this picks up a point that was made earlier, which is that it's photographers who make photographs and not cameras that make photographs. Again, I'm beating up this issue about fixating on the technology or the conditions of production or something, but to give another one of these kind of challenging examples, one can say we borrow Nick Nixon's 8x10 camera and set it up in front of some very evenly lit, no-seam white background paper, and focus it carefully and expose the negative carefully, process it properly in the darkroom, make a print of that image. If it's framed in such a way that you don't see anything but white background paper, the net result is going to be a white piece of photographic paper. That will be the photographic image that you've created. If, at the same time you're in the darkroom, if you take another piece of photographic paper and just stick it in the fixer and wash it and put it next to your photographic image, you'll have an object that's identical. They're both, we would say that one was made by a photographic process, lenses, focus, chemistry, exposure, everything that makes a photograph. The other one was not made. Neither has an image in them. So, I mean, the idea that we know what a photograph is, I think, is not at all stable, actually. We don't know what will we say? Are they both photographs? So we think they have images in them, but they don't have to have images to be photographs.
Yeah, Doug, but I think the point that PL was trying to make was that, yeah, that's cool. It's an interesting, thought experiment and all the rest of that. But we actually have a lot of photographs that are not just pieces of white paper, that have things in them, and that those are interesting to look at and talk about. And I actually think that if you can speak for yourself, you're extremely articulate. But I think...
Are you going to disagree or agree?
I'm agreeing.
Go ahead.
The way I read what you were saying was at a little bit of frustration at there was this whole tradition of image making that kind of went from unknown to passé and irrelevant with a little window in between. Is that could that be correct?
I'm not going to stop you. Keep going.
You know, the other thing is that I would also say that there are a whole lot of photographs that were not made by a photographer that are really interesting to look at. I mean, John Sharkovsky said that even an ATM machine sometimes takes a really interesting photograph. And my tastes maybe are a little more Catholic, but I'm really interested in photography in all those forms.
Except it's not made without human intention behind it.
That is true. That's true. I guess that's true. But I mean, but
we don't care what machines do. It's what human beings do with machines that matter to us.
Well, you know, although, you know, back in the day, you know, there was this argument about the death of the author, right? That got lots of play, and it was, you know, it was thought to be, you know, valuable and meaningful, and it was all about, you know, perhaps moving away from, you know, some notion of individualized authorship, and as such, you know, it was perhaps suggesting a movement towards some notion of something like distributed authorship. And one of the kind of concrete art world results we have from this, I mean, there are many things we could talk about, but one of them is the, you know, the recent rise of different kinds of collectivist art practices, and a lot of them that do so, you know, in a kind of anonymous way, you know, a way that, you know, by intention does not identify the individual actors in these anonymous art practices. And this is thought to have a value in part because it
like what?
Like what?
What are these anonymous collectivist practices? I'm just trying to situate.
The Bruce High Quality Foundation or something. You know?
Yeah, Bruce High Quality Foundation. You could talk about, you know, anything that falls under the category of tactical media. You know, basically falls into that. The Yes Men, you know, for example, the best known probably of the group, or their previous name, Artmark, right, which was all about anonymity, right? And all about the idea that there's a big amorphous group of people involved with this, and they, you know, people come and go, and it doesn't really matter, you know, who the author is. So it seems that, you know, photography, one of its great technical attributes is that it's something that, you know, that to some degree anybody can produce an image, and this then produces the technical conditions, the technological conditions for a certain kind of anonymity that's not there with more craft-dependent media, like painting, where you're much more readily able to see a signature style in it and therefore identify it with a particular author. So I worry a little bit about going too far in this sort of humanist direction or this individualist direction, where we locate the value of the photograph in intention, in individual intention.
I don't see why that's a problem.
Well, only insofar as it leaves out the
anonymity is a plus?
Well,
I don't see that.
Yeah, back in the day, I mean, you know, or it is in the context of the contemporary art world. So something like Bruce, you know, High Quality, or
that's open to discussion, obviously, but I don't see why that authorship is something to be neglected or negated or seen as less important.
That's also not what that essay was about. I mean, that's not what Bart was talking about. I mean, it's the death of the author, the birth of the reader, contextualization of these means of, you know, of meaning and an emphasis on that. I mean, it doesn't necessarily lead to... I'm just a little nervous about associating a particular thinker with a certain kind of practice that we can really safely put at a kind of arm's length distance and oppose what we're doing or sort of conventionalized art practices are doing.
And I think we might have, you know, sort of be getting a little too shoppy with this talk for our audience. Shop talky, just because we may lose people if we go down the Barth road a little too far. Sorry.
Can I say something though? This is not about Roland Barthes.
Okay.
But it is about this point, and what it brought up for me was something I was thinking about silently, listening to the same kinds of points about the person behind the camera and this kind of stuff that we've been talking about over the last hour or so. And it's just that, I mean, one of the things that seems to me different between old models of photography, chemical photography, and the digital is how much control you have over your image. That is, you know, it's a technical aspect, but it's actually a conceptual one. I mean, who makes a photograph? Does a photographer make it? Does the world make it? Does the process make it? how much control do you have over its appearance? You're shaking your head.
I'm shaking my head as a photographer, and I've worked with analog photography and film for a long time.
We'll repeat it.
I also work digitally.
He was shaking his head as a photographer.
Yeah, we'll restate it. Yeah, try to.
You know, you ought to go out and start making some pictures, because what you're saying does not mean anything in terms of making pictures with either film cameras or digital cameras. It's really what you're saying as a problem. It's not a problem. It's not an issue.
Yeah, I mean,
So, gentleman's saying that from the point of view of a photographer, what George is saying is a non-issue.
And I can respond to that from the point of view. Actually, I'm an art historian who doesn't call himself a photograph historian. I like artists who don't call themselves photographers, and I make photographs, but they're shitty. I can respond to what you're saying by saying that you're talking about a certain model of how people make photographs, how artists who call themselves photographers or photographers make photographs. There are other models. There are other ideas of people who use cameras, than that they want to prioritize their decision-making, composition, control, that they want to give some of that up. And that was possible in certain ways in the past. That is less possible, it seems to me, when you're digitally manipulating the image.
But most of the pictures that we want to look at follow the model he's talking about. That is, a man or woman goes out and takes 1,000 pictures and picks the one that captures what they want.
No, actually, I find myself wanting to look at Auger more than that kind of photograph. And what I look for in an Auger,
Looking at every picture that Auger ever took?
I'll look at any one that you show me. And I'm not going to look for Auger's authorial control over his image.
Wait a minute. I can't understand what you're saying. That that now people have less control over what.
Now they have more. And one of the wonders
Why
of
do they have
photography,
more?
one of the things I love about photography was the less control.
But
More chance, more accident, more mistakes, more things that enter the frame that you didn't put there or want there, more things that people can see that the author didn't want them to see.
But there's if you want to have a real conversation, Ache, let me tell you, he was in control of what he was doing.
We're not
I
gonna
mean,
do
he
this
was
today.
really in control.
We're not going to do this today. I mean, I'm not going to do it.
Well, I don't know.
This is an old MoMA fight that I'm not going to take part in.
Hold on, yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's good.
Contrary to what you're saying, 5 years ago, I had an exhibition in an art school in Philadelphia. I showed 16 by 20 black and white silver gelatin prints. I got an email from the gallery director saying there was a group of students, this is an art school, they're all working on BFAs and MFAs, and they were having a conversation about my photographs, and they couldn't decide whether the prints were gelatin silver or inkjet. And they finally collectively decided they were inkjet. I was kind of annoyed by that until an older colleague, I still have older colleagues, pointed out to me that these students had not seen silver gelatin prints that were so evenly made. So they assumed they had to have been made by an inkjet printer.
I think you're making my point, though. I like bad prints. I like prints that have lots of mistakes in them, and I like.
Can I just repeat quickly what he said? Is that he said that he showed gelatin silver prints at a gallery at an art school, and that a bunch of young students came and they looked at the silver prints, and they had a discussion amongst themselves whether they were silver prints or they were inkjet prints, and you were feeling very annoyed about that until somebody told you that the fact of the matter was that they had never seen really good gelatin silver prints that were properly printed, and so they had nothing to compare them to, and so that was the point.
I'd rather talk about Roland Barthes.
All right, we're going to take another question. How about that? David.
Could I just say, first of all, plug Roland Barthes. If you haven't read Roland Barthes, it's a great book. And maybe we can't rehash it. But what I wanted to say was when I walked through the gallery, I saw Mike Mandel and Larry Sultan's evidence photographs on the wall. I was riveted. I went to see those photographs. I thought it was interesting that they were photographs on the wall in frames, because I thought it was a book. But that's a process. And I think those were photographs not taken by them. And yet, I think that there's the act of making a photograph is taking something that's ready-made and framing it. If you make a photograph, or you take a photograph that's already made and you frame it, you put it into another context. And I think that, you know, this is maybe a problematic that we have to add to the mix.
David?
Thank you. So I want to ask a question that's definitely, I think, going to take us away from the Plumbers Convention kind of talk, if that's okay. Last night there was, and today, there's been many, many frames put around this question of, is photography over? We've had philosophical, we've had artistic, we've had social, we've had political, we've had spiritual, etc. One was missing, and we did talk last night about things being, the miracles and things being miraculous, and you may not have caught it, but there was a miracle last night. Despite the presence of a University of Chicago professor on this panel, the only panelist who made any comment whatsoever last night around the economic frame actually teaches at Brown. That is a miracle. So what I'd like to touch on is, you know, and we've talked a lot about it. Peter, if you're right about chemical-based or whatever we're calling that kind of photography being dead, it's very obvious why. Because all of the artistic uses of that medium ever were only just a tiny little, you know, piece of foam on the top of an ocean of all of us amateurs using it. And as soon as the amateur ocean got drained, the foam is not sustainable. So an economic analysis says we don't need to argue about that at all because we know where it's going. If you put an economic frame around this question and think for a second about photography being over, Charlotte, you made a great comment, and you repeated it today. That's a huge economic question, which is what's the role of a museum going forward, where we want to try to get people to experience things physically, have a physical experience with objects. That's what art museums do. You know, talk about things possibly being over that we should worry about. That sounds like something we should worry about. And I'd love to hear the panel address that.
Shall I go first? Go for it. You know, about 15 years ago, I started doing shows around what was called commercial photography, mainly about fashion photography, some advertising. And I was told at the time it was absolute career suicide as a curator to deal with these bad worlds. But actually what had happened by the mid-90s was, of course, you couldn't really say that contemporary art photography wasn't commercial and that you were dealing with this production which was geared towards the market, even in places that don't have a particularly strong market. And I suppose I sort of didn't feel that there was anyone who wanted to talk about that on the panel in our closed session, about the economics of it, because we are talking about technologies that were developed for commercial markets, whether that's for amateur use or for the industries. And I mean, I don't think the jury is out on things like what happens now that something like National Geographic or Style magazines go entirely online and they now have their clammy hands on the iPad, and actually it's about the layering of visual imagery and the haptic nature of it and being able to turn an object that you might buy or want to discover. So really, you've got what you might want to take ownership of as photographic language being inherently reshaped in its technologically by the commercial industries of photography. So, I mean, I do find that really interesting, and it just isn't something that we've really talked about.
I couldn't agree with you more. But that's always been the case. The tiny little foam of people who wanted to use photography to make works of art have always had to use the materials that were created for, as you say, commercial interests, and then since 1888, a huge amateur market. You're absolutely right. That's always been that way.
But now we know that analog, like gelatin silver papers, aren't going to totally disappear. They're going to be boutique. They're just going to be super expensive, i.e. catering to the market, which is artists. What does it mean for a museum? Do you go on collecting that niche and just fess up to that? Or do you actually have a responsibility to be in discourse with the haptic experience of photography, even if artists aren't doing it yet?
Well, museums are actually very young. They're only a little more than 200 years old. You know, when you killed the king, you ended up with the king's pictures that then belonged to the people.
Yeah, I kind of know that, but what's
well,
your
no,
point?
I know. It's just a repository for stuff, right, that is owned collectively. Right? But when you're talking about do art museums that deal with photography deal with photographs that were not made as works of art? Yes, of course. It's a huge part of the history of photography.
So how are you narrating that within?
What do you mean?
Within your A history of photography, how do you narrate this moment?
I'm sorry, I still didn't narrate this moment. Well, it's up for grabs. No, I mean, it's not like when you say this moment, the museums only deal with the past, even if the past is last week. So, and as Corey said, you try to respond to what you think is interesting. And it's by definition, the response is imperfect.
Photography curators in museums are not yet so much showing photographs on screens, are they?
No,
wouldn't that be a way of responding to how photography is?
The people who define the future of photography or anything else are the people who make it, and the museum is always following along behind imperfectly.
But in its representation of what today is vernacular photography, I mean, most of that is for the screen.
Yeah, any museum can define what it thinks its mission is for itself, and people can applaud or boo or whatever, or they go to their congressman and say, we want to put this museum out of business, or however you want to put it. It's not like there's a dictator who says this is what all museums have to do. And then it's a question of judgment. It's not, when you say photographic imagery not made to be works of art is part and parcel of the entire history of photography. But it doesn't mean that everything that is being made is of equal interest.
No, absolutely. So I was asking about your decision making.
Doesn't it seem like...
As I said, it's up for grabs. You make a new decision every day.
I don't think it can be overlooked that one of the criteria for museums is to get people to pay $20 to get in. And that, a bunch of students are going to be happy with a projection or, a room full of seagulls or whatever you want. Photography, I think, kind of weirdly lags behind in that, and maybe that's why photography winds up, as Charlotte said, usually being exhibited somewhere near the bathroom. But it's been given for a long time what was considered to be secondary space, afterthoughts. I mean, even at MoMA, I think that you can't compare the kinds of spaces that have been devoted even in the new museum. And I think that there's something quite weird about that. And if photography in its new iteration as digital is going to wind up like a lot of other digital mediums, projecting itself on the walls and stuff like that, it seems to me the main reason that that's going to be is to, dumb it down for an audience that really is going to museums to be entertained.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, is there some real anxiety that we're not dealing with cell phone photos? I mean, that they should be shown or collected or dealt with? I don't understand.
Well, I mean, for example, there could be a whole. I'm sorry, just come to you and say a whole parallel discussion about what's happening in film, right? I mean, you could talk some of the same things, and film festivals do have in their, experimental section have, films made on cell phones. And look at, I don't know, alternative platforms or whatever it might be called. And I was wondering about the place of that in photography, if there was one.
Well, but these are also not anonymous makers or not people who are just sort of like, popping photos with their cell phones. I mean, there's like Rob Pruitt had a show called iPhone, and then it was sold in a commercial gallery. It was at Gavin Brown's, and it was
sure.
And then there's Andrea Zeitel did a kind of like, there was a moving photo slide digital piece on a flat screen. There's several examples of people using it in a specific way. I sort of don't understand. I don't understand what the question is about presenting on screens, or whether or not there needs to be.
I would agree that it ought to be artist led, if it wasn't for the fact that the museum already shows vernacular photography in the past.
Maybe the question is whether museums can be responsive to the changes in how photographs are used in the world. And I mean, I think we've done, Nan Goldin's Ballad of Sexual Dependency would be perhaps one example. I mean, I don't think that any of us are wedded to the idea that a photograph has to be something on a piece of paper necessarily. We showed a piece actually by Lucas Samaras a number of years ago. I can't remember what the thing is called, but it's essentially a computer terminal on which you get to navigate around his desktop and look at his pictures and look at his little film clips. And what was interesting was it was a very generational thing, actually. A lot of the sort of people more accustomed to traditional work were completely perplexed by the work. And the younger people spent all their time deleting the things off of the computer, so that we had to reboot it every night. I think we had, of course, a backup, but it was a pretty interesting dialogue.
But can I also suggest, in terms of our defining of museums and the way it collects, I mean, coming from Victoria and Albert Museum, it was the library in 1904 to 1906 who collected the 400 Atches from Atches and put them in filing cabinets where they were completely ignored until the 70s and then reframed. And I think there is an element of what about the libraries within art institutions and how they archive. Like the British Library's amazing project of taking these kind of like daily grabs of the behaviour and the content of the web, or a project we're working on which is doing a sort of a bequest scheme where you can donate your virtual life to the museum as this kind of record and the alternative to the family album. There are other ways of doing it.
Hi, my question was actually starting with Vince, but then opening up to everyone. I was thinking about the last two triennials at the International Center of Photography in New York. And I think one of the reasons why they were quite challenging and productive exhibitions was by virtue of the fact that they both incorporated a lot of media that weren't specifically photography in the sense that we've been talking about it per se. There's a lot of sculpture, there's a lot of installation, there are vitrine-based works, there's projections. I think it speaks to this common thread right now. But I was wondering, Vince, if you could talk to how you worked with that specifically within the triennial, and then open it up to the panel from there.
That's difficult for me to do that because Carol Squires and I were involved with every show that year, last year, and while the triennial was being planned, we were putting together the Abaddonn show, so we had less involvement with that than the other curators, Christopher Phillips and Kristen Lubin. But we did see all the videos. And from the beginning, ICP, the idea of the triennial was that it would include video as well as photo. And I think that's always been kind of a challenge to make that work, to find a way to put it into the space, to make the spaces lively, and make each piece useful and visible without conflicting with everything else nearby. And I think for us, all being a little, or at least I should maybe just characterize myself, somewhat resistant to video in galleries. It's usually the thing that I walk past quickly and try to get past. We really wanted to get material that stopped us, that made us want to stop and look and spend time with it, and hope that the audience would have the same reaction. So our theme was very generally, very broadly fashion, but it ended up being much more the sense of the way people present themselves in the very broadest sense, the way people dress themselves. So we did find, I think, a number of videos that really address that in a kind of vague way, but that I think also were attention-getting and not just kind of ideas. I think we all were looking at video from a very photographic point of view and looking at things that would make us stop and spend time. And I think that's, that in the end, that was what we really leaned toward. And hopefully it worked.
Maybe, since you asked about the triennial, maybe it would be not entirely irrelevant if I mentioned something about the Biennale in Venice, my experience of the photography there, and I'm going to do that rather vulgar thing of quoting myself. And this is what the protagonist in my novel, Geoff in Venice, this is his experience of the photographs there. Needless to say, these pictures, like all the other photographs on offer, were the size of the raft of the Medusa. So what if they were just snaps of someone jerking off in a leather armchair in an apartment in Zurich? So what if it was just a half-eaten, pre-packaged egg and cress sandwich abandoned on the seat of a bus shelter in Stockholm? So what if it was a portrait of the artist's sour-faced grandmother pushing her shopping trolley round a poorly stocked supermarket in Barnsley? Blow them up big enough and they looked like shit, frankly. But they looked like art too.